Cominciamo questo.
Okay, we'll move on to our next exchange of views with the President of the Central Tibetan Administration, Sikyong Dr. Lobsang Sangay. We have had the honour last November of welcoming four distinguished guests from the Tibetan Parliament in exile who were undertaking a visit to several European countries, and today we have an exceptional opportunity to continue our analysis and discussion on human rights situation in Tibet with the presence of Lobsang Sangay, the President of the Central Tibetan Administration. I'd like to warmly welcome you and your whole delegation. It's a great opportunity to hear firsthand from a Tibetan leader about the challenges and his vision for the Tibetan community. But it should also demonstrate that we will always provide a platform for those who work towards dialogue, peaceful solutions, and who advocate for human rights. For us, in line with our mandate, Tibet is first and foremost an issue of protecting universal human rights, cultural rights, freedom of religion and belief, and protecting the environment and striving for stability through dialogue. When I say that the issue of Tibet is important for the European Parliament, this could sound like an empty phrase, but I can back it up by referring to the numerous parliamentary resolutions, hearings, and other meetings we've had on this issue here in the Parliament, as well as the opening of the continuing dialogue to solve the Tibetan issue. And we've received the Dalai Lama on numerous occasions as well. Last Thursday, during Parliament's plenary session, we adopted a so-called urgency resolution on some individual cases in China. I think that our commitment will continue unrelentingly. I don't want to go on any further. I'd like to give you the floor to give us your presentation. Thank you. We have a microphone, please. Microphone for the speaker. Microphone, please.
Thank you, Chairman, for the privilege and honor to be here at the Human Rights Subcommittee. And I would like to firstly acknowledge the urgency resolution passed by the European Parliament recently, expressing its concern for human rights in Tibet, and especially calling on the Chinese government to solve the issue of Tibet peacefully through dialogue between the representative of the Chinese government and envoys of the Dalai Lama, for which we are very grateful. The resolution sends a clear message to Beijing that European Union, particularly its parliament, is concerned about human rights situation in Tibet, and also sends a message of hope, a strong message to Tibetans inside Tibet, because there are still hundreds of Tibetans who are in prison for expressing their views, for asserting their environmental rights, for asserting their human rights, and they are in prison. And for them it's very important to hear a message from Brussels that their rights, even though violated, are very much a concern for the European Parliament. So this year marks the 60th year of Tibet coming under occupation of China, and unfortunately 60 years of tragedy and sadness and pain and repression. Tibet is not a small country. It is as big as Western Europe with 2.5 million square kilometers of land, but it has only 6 million population. Hence, presently, there is political repression going on, in the sense that if 2 or 3 Tibetans gather in the streets or market and protest, quickly they will be detained and imprisoned for a long time. And if you are caught with a picture of His Holiness Dalai Lama, you could go to jail. And if you are caught, even with a copy of Universal Declaration of Human Rights, you could be in trouble. So at one time, UN Human Rights Commissioner was in Lhasa. She, in fact, distributed a copy of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to the Tibetan people, thereby challenging the Chinese authorities. Obviously, at that particular time, the Tibetans did not face any repercussion, but soon after she left, I'm not so sure what could be the fate of those Tibetans who got a copy of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So there is cultural assimilation going on, as we heard in the previous panel also, at the university level, at the high school level, middle school level. The medium of instruction in Tibetan schools are in Chinese language, not in Tibetan language. Even though the Chinese constitution encourages the usage of Tibetan language, but it is not the case. Economic discrimination is happening. If you go to Lhasa, the capital city of Tibet, you will see economic growth. Tall buildings have come, good roads have come, electricity have come. But if you actually analyze it, you find in the capital city of Tibet, 80 plus, if not 90+% of hotels, shops, restaurants, even the taxis are owned or run by Chinese, not by Tibetans. And hence there is social discrimination to begin with, because Han Chinese, they think they're superior, not just to Tibetans, by, Tungo, the Middle Kingdom. By definition, all the people in the periphery, including Tibetans, are barbarians. By extension, I think people in Belgium and Brussels are also barbarians. Hence the social discrimination that you are of, the inferior nationality is very much there. And then environmental destruction, it's happening. As you might know, Tibet is the water tower of Asia. 10 major rivers of Asia flow from Tibet. And 1.4 billion people in Asia are dependent on water flowing from Tibet. And the crisis that's happening in Asia is real, because China has 19% of the world population, but only 12% of fresh water, which means 7% or equivalent of 400 million Chinese are already facing water scarcity. The situation in Bangladesh is worse, situation in India is worse, and situation in Pakistan is worse. But Tibet is the main source of water for that region of Asia. And unfortunately, with the climate change and global warming, 50% of glaciers of Tibet have already melted. By 2100, according to NASA, the remaining 75% of the 46,000 glaciers that Tibet has will also melt and disappear. If that happens, there will be a major water crisis in that part of the region. And presently, Tibet is the main source of water for that region. Hence, Tibet is not just important from human rights point of view, but also from environmental point of view. In the last 60 years, we are proud to say that, if you look at global conflicts around the world, including IS and others, they resort to violence. They get attention. A lot of leaders in the capitals of various countries come out and say something for or against all the violence that's going on. But as far as Tibetans are concerned, we've been a follower of and we've been practicing nonviolence for all these years. Even though I run an exile administration, but I am democratically elected by Tibetans in 40 countries. So we practice democracy as well. And human rights is, we feel, should be universal, and universally defined human rights should be implemented. But the recent phenomenon, or from the Chinese side, they are coming out with human rights with Chinese characteristic, which means the definition of human rights that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights says, or the European Parliament says, does not apply to them. And what do you do about it? And in the last 10, 15 years now, the human rights dialogue between Belgium or with Beijing, or European Union with China, the bilateral human rights dialogue that has taken place is not working. Initially, this idea was initiated with a hope that if you don't talk about human rights publicly, and you take the human rights dialogue privately, the Chinese will not lose face and they will adhere to Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That has not worked. In the last 10 years, human rights situation in Tibet has gone from bad to worse. For example, Larungar Monastery used to have 12,000 monks and nuns. But from August of 2016 to August of 2017, in 12 months, the Larungar Monastery was demolished and reduced to 5,000 monks and nuns. As we speak, Yashingar nunnery has 6,000 nuns. It's being demolished and reduced to 2,000 or 3,000 nuns. And 3 nuns in Larungar committed suicide because all they had was the small thatched roof they had as a nun. When it was destroyed, their life was destroyed. And they were told never to come back to Larungar and practice Buddhism. When you take your home, their practice, and then they have no option but to commit suicide. Similarly, 151 Tibetans have committed self-immolation. They have burned themselves. Now, we discourage self-immolation. We have done so consistently and categorically. But still this year, 6 or 7 Tibetans in Tibet have burned themselves. That shows the gravity of the situation, how desperate Tibetans are, that they are giving up their precious life for the sake of human rights. Because if what China says is true, the Tibetans are content and they are living in socialist paradise, that's what they say. If that's true, why would anyone burn oneself? And among the self-immolators, there are monks, there are nuns, there are farmers, there are nomads, there are students, there are teenagers, there are father, mother, all aspects of Tibetan life, and all from all parts of Tibet are burning themselves and committing self-immolation. So this is the situation of Tibet, and hence, European Union speaking on human rights issue is much appreciated and much needed in this time. And the solution that we propose is middle way approach, which is middle of repression and separation. So what we say is, if the Chinese authorities end repression of the Tibetan people and give them genuine autonomy as per Chinese laws, as per Chinese constitution within China, then we will not seek separation from China. This is a win-win proposition, a very reasonable proposition envisioned by His Holiness Dalai Lama and proposed by the Tibetan people. And I hope the Chinese leaders in Beijing will listen to the recently passed urgency resolution and welcome or invite envoys of the Dalai Lama to come to Beijing to have dialogue on how best to address the issue of Tibet peacefully. So with that, I would like to thank the Honorable Chairman and the committee members for allowing me to speak and reflect on the situation in Tibet. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Grazie a lei.
Thank you. Now we'll hear from members. Mr. Scott-Cato.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'd like to start by welcoming you to the committee. It's a pleasure to see you here, and I hope you'll be able to take our wishes of solidarity and affection back to His Holiness the Dalai Lama. I think I completely agree with what you said about the way Tibet approaches the defence of human rights, and I think in many ways we can see it as a test case for the peaceful defence of human rights. And if that's what we believe in the European institutions and in the European Parliament, then we have to do what we can to make sure that your approach is successful. Otherwise, why would other people continue to follow it, even though that is what we say we are committed to? As you're well aware, the 35th round of the EU-China human rights dialogue that was held in June of last year included discussion of the issue of Tibet amongst other issues. But given the worsening situation of human rights in China, as reflected in the resolution passed by the Parliament last week, can you tell us what you think about those talks? Do you think that they're effective? Have they led to tangible results for Tibet? And have you got any comments to make about the remarks by French President Macron, where he said that he felt that raising the question of human rights in discussions with China was actually counterproductive? I find that quite incomprehensible myself. And then moving on to what we can actually do, we're well aware here in the Parliament that Commissioner Malmström makes much play of the idea of trade for all, and just last week, speaking at a Youth and Leaders Summit in Paris, she again emphasised the need for values-based trade and the importance of setting high standards, including on human rights, in our bilateral relations. China is, of course, the biggest source of imports for the EU and its second biggest export market. On average, the two trade 1 billion in goods every day. So how do you feel that the EU can deliver on human rights principles with regard to the China-Tibet situation in terms of our trade policy? And, could you tell us a little bit more about how you think we could make progress in that area? Thank you.
Grazie, onorevole.
Thank you, Mr. Ostrovicius.
Chair. Dr. Lobsang Sangai, most welcome to the European Parliament. It's a pleasure to see you and to be acquainted with the situation in Tibet from yourself. Well, it's a big country indeed. You rightly said it's by size of Western Europe, and with such a scarce density of population like 6 million people, it might be a great possible risk for increased migration from the mainland China. Would you comment on this? I mean, what are the migration tendencies which are observed recently, especially in Tibet? What do they suggest to Tibetan people at large? We noticed a criticism expressed by many representatives of Tibet on kind of worsening of the human rights situations under the presidency of Xi Jinping. Would you agree with this general observation? To what extent his point of view influences the situation on the ground? And what is your experience with formal and informal dialogue with the Chinese central authorities? I mean, are there any recent commitments and results which might bring a certain hope for a better future? Thank you.
Grazie, onorevole.
Thank you, Mr. Toss.
Elnök úr, tegnap együtt voltunk a Tibet.
Thank you. Yesterday, we met with colleagues and friends from Tibet, and I would like to reassure you that you can count on us. We will do everything that we can in order to support the fight for freedom and justice in Tibet. I would like to congratulate you for entering into this dialogue without aggression, and for the fact that you really are fighting for the interests of your people. Across the globe, we are fighting against terrorism, racism. The Tibetans are trying to fight that fight in a peaceful way, with peaceful means, following in the example of the Dalai Lama, and that is something which I think we must welcome. I was indignant when I heard about the human rights violations that had taken place. Last week, we dealt with the case of Tashi Wangchuk, who has spoken out in favour of the use of the Tibetan language, and he's also an advocate of Tibetan culture and religious freedom. Religious freedom is not guaranteed. Human rights activists and religious leaders and religious personalities are being put in jail. Dear colleagues, we must support Tibet's endeavours to achieve autonomy. the Tibetan government and President Lobsang Sangay stand for those endeavours. I'd like to draw attention to a couple of points. On the Chinese side, we are seeing attempts to really exclude the use of the Tibetan language. I read somewhere that 30,000 Chinese teachers in Tibet are being brought in and invited to settle in Tibet. And as such, the language of the minority community is being pushed into the margins. I think that when it comes to negotiations between China and the EU, we should do a lot more to make sure that there is better acceptance of the rights of these minorities. When it comes to bilingualism, I'd like to make a suggestion, and I'll say this in English.
EU member states have extensive experience with bilingualism, experience that we could and should share with Chinese authorities in a way that would allow that different languages be taught efficiently, protecting the identity of those who speak it, the minorities. We could encourage sharing our expertise the same way we already do with the Chinese counterparts in the area of environment. In environment, we have managed to build up good cooperation in many areas, including water, air, waste management, biodiversity. I suggest that we focus on this more, to focus more on bilingualism, propose to the EEAS to include it in their bilateral meetings with China. EU special perspective for EU Special Representative for Human Rights, Mr. Lambrinidis, could be involved in this as well. We have to try to come into dialogue and efficient dialogue with the Chinese partner. Thank you.
Grazie.
Thank you. Now we'll hear from Mrs. Darren Deria, who's Desk Officer for China from the EEAS. You have the floor, Madam.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for having provided this platform for this important discussion and allowing us to hear once again about the situation in Tibet. I would like to reiterate that the EU is attached to the One China policy, and we do not question that Tibet is an integral part of China. Within this framework, we're committed to engage with China to improve the situation on the ground. We have in the past, and we continue to call on the Chinese authorities to engage for dialogue and peaceful resolution of the situation in Tibet with respect for Tibetan culture, language, religion, and traditions, and also to refrain from any use of force and allow for peaceful protests and respect human rights in Tibet, as well as in other parts of China. This year marks the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and I'd like to underline that we share the observations made here that China's approach to human rights or approach to human rights with Chinese characteristics is a challenge to the universality of human rights. And China has signed up to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and we expect China to respect this, as well as its obligations under international law and under China's constitution, which should allow for the rights of minorities and rights such as rights of education in Tibetan language. As regards to the bilateral human rights dialogue between the European Union and China, I would like to underline that the existence of the human rights dialogue is not and has not been an obstacle for the European Union to make public statements and to voice its concerns about the situation in China. We have done so in many occasions, be it through spokesperson statements, be it through local statements. We published a press release after the human rights dialogue detailing all the issues that we discussed and all the individual cases we actually raised, which included a number of Tibetan activists who face criminal charges or who have been imprisoned for exercising their right to freedom of expression. This included Tashi Wangchuk, Druklo, Lobsang Kunchok. We've also engaged in the debates in the European Parliament, including the urgency debate that took place last week on the 18th of January, and underlined our call to release of all the prisoners of conscience, all the human rights defenders who have been detained in China, not least of Tashi Wangchuk. And we do not hesitate from repeating this call. I thank you very much for the information provided, and I also would like to underline that we have taken note of Honourable Member of the European Parliament, Mr. Turkish's suggestion on the EU engaging more on minority rights and rights in the education in mother tongue. I am happy to say that we have actually started working on a project by which we could try to engage with Chinese authorities to share experiences. And we expect, hopefully, the Chinese authorities to look upon this favorably and to show readiness to engage with us to take this issue further. Thank you very much.
Grazie.
Thank you. Now, before giving you the floor, I would like to say that the Chinese were not very happy about your presence here in the European Parliament. We received notice that they would have preferred we take a different decision, but I would like to say that we ignored that, and we'll give you the floor.
Thank you very much, Honourable Chairman. I know Chinese government is not so happy where I go, and Chinese embassy is very busy where I go. So it's a very honorable stand that you took to invite me here and then give the platform to give a perspective of the Tibetan side. You know, sometimes when Chinese government says that Tibetans are very happy and they will follow Beijing's rule, we often put up a very democratic challenge, and you say anytime you want to have election in Tibet, put up one Chinese candidate and put up one Tibetan candidate, and if I vote to be the Tibetan candidate, I'm happily willing to be, and I can pretty much say that we will win hands down. We will win the election hands down. So the fact that Chinese government doesn't allow free and fair election in Tibet clearly demonstrates that they have something to hide. And I did not go far to convince that the human rights situation in Tibet is serious, because Freedom House comes out with Freedom Index every year. And 2 years ago they came out, and this year also they have come out, and they have listed Tibet as least free country or region after Syria. Now we know the situation in Syria, but after Syria, Tibet is the least free region of the world. Also, Reporters Without Borders have issued a statement based on interviews of journalists in Beijing. They say that it's more difficult to get access for journalists to Tibet than to North Korea. Now, we all read about North Korea, we all know about North Korea, but how many of us know it is more difficult to get access to Tibet? Hence, I take the point made by honourable members of Parliament and also the representative from EU Foreign Office that EU is trying, and I wish all of you the very best, and grateful for being with us. But the reality in Tibet is that since the bilateral human rights dialogue happened, it has gotten from bad to worse. In fact, now the Chinese government has imposed or implemented a grid system, the surveillance system, where everything is monitored. Now, Tibetan nomads and farmers are issued a ID card with biometric chips, of second-generation biometric chips. So their movements are tracked. And they have, in fact, an algorithm to track which potential nomadic area or which village could have protest. And in fact, just 2 years ago, the Chinese government has hired around 30,000 security personnel in Tibet, more than the private sector and the public sector combined, the employment generated. So that shows their securitization of Tibetan area is very, very serious. So all these things are happening. So unfortunately, this year marks the 70th anniversary of Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is a milestone, which is a great achievement. As far as Tibet and Tibetan people are concerned, there's a regression of human rights in the last 60 years than to celebrate the 70th anniversary. And I take the point made by Honourable Member of Parliament that Tibet has been the role model. We've been nonviolent, we've been democratic, and then there are many conflict areas around the world. They are watching which model to follow, a nonviolent model, a model based on compassion and dialogue, or a violent model. So each time a leader and leaders make comments about violence and terrorism and other forms of conflicts, then they look and say, maybe we should follow other model, not the Tibetan model. Hence, whether you support Tibet issue or not, you are influencing the other conflict areas around the world to which model to follow. And hence, Tibetans being the good guys at this time should be supported by various capitals and leaders around the world. So raising human rights is definitely not counterproductive. And one should raise human rights with the Chinese government. And all we ask for, as far as trade, environmental issues, human rights concerned, all we ask for from the Chinese government, all European Union can ask for from Chinese government is reciprocity. And whatever you do to you, you should do to us. So this is one thing that one must consider. So we are not saying that Chinese government should give European journalists special access. All we are saying is Chinese journalists can come to Europe, Chinese academy can come to Europe, Chinese officials can come to Europe. Similarly, European officials should have access to Tibet, and European journalists should have access to Tibet, and European academic should have access to Tibet. That reciprocity should be the norm, and I hope that will be implemented. And I fully acknowledge that bilingualism is very important. And Tashi Wangchuk, an advocate of bilingualism, which is permitted as per Chinese laws, he went to Beijing to make a case, and he is in prison now, and the trial just ended, and the sentence is pending. And that clearly shows that even the legally provided and protected right of bilingualism is not practiced in China. So I need not go far because the time has run out, and I just want to thank the Chair and the subcommittee for giving me this platform and making Chinese embassy a bit unhappy. I know you have, from Buddhist point of view, you have earned a lot of good karma. So in this life and next life, you'll be a very happy person. So with the blessing of Buddha, and I hope Tibetans in Tibet will also get to see and realize their dream, that is the return of His Holiness Dalai Lama to Tibet and basic freedom for the Tibetan people. Thank you very much.
Grazie a lei.
Thank you to you. And the battle continues to defend human rights of the Tibetan people. Thank you very much, and good luck.